Hello, and thanks for tuning in to Look Up, the news and current affairs programme from Compass Media. Every week, myself, Finbar Padraig, and my co-host Padraig look at news stories that either haven't got into the mainstream headlines or maybe haven't had a fair and balanced hearing in the mainstream headlines. Thanks for joining us again tonight, Padraig.
Yeah, no problem, Finbar. Happy to join you.
We've got a busy show as usual. You're going to lead off, Padraig, with the demonstration in Dublin last Saturday that has been billed as an anti-racism demonstration. Do you want to lead with that one?
Sure, Finbar. So, just going to lead with, I have two stories really around this to try and give you the background. So, tens of thousands of people took to the streets of Dublin last Saturday expressing solidarity with refugees and migrants. The event began at Parnell Square before marching to the Customs House in the City Quays. Organisers have said that as many as 50,000 people were taking part, while the Garda at the scene estimated the number at over 20,000. There were a wide variety of groups and parties taking part. The event was organised in response to some anti-migrant protests that have been held outside centres housing refugees or asylum seekers in counties including Dublin, Cork and Kildare. The state is providing accommodation to more than 52,000 Ukrainian people and more than 19,300 asylum seekers, a significant increase in the numbers recorded in previous years. Hotels, B&Bs and refurbished public buildings are being used to house the international protection applicants. In recent months, local groups have raised concerns that they had not been consulted before migrants were moved into their communities. Some have also raised concerns about a lack of services to cater for an increased population. Politicians have argued that a lack of engagement from authorities in some cases has left a vacuum for misinformation to grow and false rumours to spread, sometimes by members of the far right. Activists and academic Ava Smith told the rally that the large turnout was important as it sent out a huge message to government. She said, Ireland for All is a broad 32-county coalition of activists, grassroots and community groups, NGOs and political parties, trade unions. We are all in this coalition together. We've come together to celebrate the fabulous rich variety and diversity that is Ireland today. We are here to stand up against the hatred and disinformation being spewed out by far-right extremists. She called for government action, saying that the cost of living rise, public health service crisis, public service crisis, racism, and ongoing appalling violence against women and girls has to end. They have to act now. She was joined on stage by folk singer Christy Moore, who told the crowd he was there to express his revulsion on attacks on refugees, while veteran civil rights campaigner and former MP Bernadette McCalliskey said the demonstration was only the start. She said there are questions that have to be asked of this nation. Which side are you on? The question has to be answered by our politicians. It has to be answered by the state, by the churches, by the organisations, by the individual people. So maybe we'll just roll a couple of clips there, Finbar, just to show these demonstrations.
Yeah, we'll open up with Bernadette Devlin talking or making her speech at the demo. It's only 11 seconds, I think we have of that. And then we roll into Christy Moore and we'll be back to you within a minute or two.
If you are not on the side of equality and rights for every human being, there is no other end to the road you are on than fascism.
Years before I saw the light of morning, a comradeship of heroes was laid. From every corner of the world came standing the 15th International.
So that was Christy Moore at the demonstration, billed as an anti-racism demonstration last week. There was pretty big demonstration. I'm not sure about the claim that there was 50,000 people at it. From what I can gather, looking in, there was two sentiments. There was the sentiment of anti-racism, which I fully agree with, but there was also a more subdued sentiment suggesting that Ireland can cope and that Ireland should have open borders. Some of the organisers are very much, I believe, in favour of absolute open borders, which is a policy that just is completely impractical to my point of view. Sharon Kagan in the Seanad, or the Irish Senate, the other day made a speech in which she made the points about distinguishing between asylum seekers and economic migrants, and that people who apply for the asylums through the asylum process, if they're deserving of asylum, they should get asylum. But those that are found to be abusing the asylum process should not be given asylum. This is Sharon Geoghegan in the Shannon this week.
Some of the left seem to believe once somebody applies for asylum, they're entitled to it, that all persons applying for international protections do so genuinely, and any hesitation on the part of the state to grant them full access and benefits is xenophobic. This, of course, is nonsense. No country has a duty to accept all asylum seekers who present at its borders. We have a duty to examine applications and appraise them fairly, and to separate the genuine applicants from the others. The question again being, what is a genuine applicant? When I use that word, I don't use it in the strict official sense. The Department of Justice has a litany of tests which are used in the examination of applications, and I'm not going to go into these here. What I mean, what is a genuine asylum seeker in the mind of the public? We might think of someone fleeing war, famine, persecution, someone who has removed themselves from their family from immediate danger, or who would die, be killed, or suffer extreme hardship were they to return. This generally is what the public view as a genuine asylum seeker. But of course, not all asylum seekers come to our shores fleeing such circumstances. Some come from merely poor countries in the knowledge that they have a better chance of earning more money and enjoying a higher standard of living in Ireland than they do in their home country. These people, while technically asylum seekers, are better described as economic migrants. They have moved country to improve their economic prospects for nothing more, nothing less. Most sane people are of the opinion that our duty to these people is lower than we have towards persons fleeing war and persecution. I am one of these people. While I admire the gumption and attitude of self-preservation in uprooting and moving country to better their lot in life, we simply do not owe economic migrants the same level of provision and protection as we do other cohorts of people in need of such.
Senator, I'm really sorry to interrupt you. I've been called for a vote in the Dáil that I didn't recognise.
Do you want to hold on?
Can we ask for a suspension?
Yeah, no problem.
Senator, I'm really sorry.
No problem.
That's very rude of me.
Thank you.
Just
We have to suspend.
given my orders.
So that was Sharon Geoghegan, the senator, the Irish senator in the Irish Senate, or Shannon, as it's called here in Ireland. What did you think of that, Padraig?
Yeah, well, I suppose this is what we do need to have definition in the different types of immigrant that has to come into the country and the various different reasons why they come in, because we do need to clear some of the. I don't like using this term, but in fairness, like there is misinformation out there that are trying to scapegoat people who are coming into the country and make them the reason for a lot of things, and that is the far right attitude, which is based on, people shouldn't be here, they're the cause of our homeless crisis, when that's not the fact. Like, the fact of the matter is there was things here before. So if somebody is going to bring it into the public domain, into houses the Oireachtas to have it discussed, I think that's a positive thing, because we do need to talk about these things.
But it is affecting our housing crisis, and it is affecting our tourism industry, and to deny that fact, and I'm not saying you're denying it, but to deny that fact in general, I don't think is healthy in a debate either. And I would agree with the senator that we do have provisions to accommodate asylum seekers, and they don't seem to be applied. And I think that's for a financial and economic reason. It's to get more labour, cheap labour, into the country. I think that's really what it's about. Every one of these people have to be housed. If you look at the M-Compass Media website, you'll see a story that we put up today in relation to 224 men who've applied through the asylum process, who have come to Ireland in the last week or two, and they are now sleeping on the streets of Dublin. They have no provisions whatsoever. They've been given no form of accommodation, no form of monies, they're left on the street. And the author, Anne Kavanagh, of that particular article on the M-Compass Media website suggested that if these people feel that they made a wrong decision in coming to Ireland, because there's nothing here for them, they don't have a roof over their head, if we were to give them some kind of a grant and pay for their flight home, just to get them into a situation where they could at least go back to family and have something, rather than being left on the street. Padraig, you have a few headlines that you wanted to look at as well.
Yeah, Finbar. So what I'm trying to highlight on these things each week is the different narratives and the confusing headlines that there are out there for people trying to make sense of all the different perspectives that they're hearing, and maybe the more prominent perspective that they're being encouraged to undertake themselves. So you obviously can see on the left, which would have been the first story that I read out, just was around the march that there was there on Saturday. Just having the centre there, just a tweet from Mary Lou McDonald, which is just outlining her position, her party's position, and the way they see things. And then you have a third one over here on the right side of the screen, which is saying over 60% of asylum applicants at Dublin Airport had no ID. Now, this is something that would be irking a lot of people, because this is what a certain section of people are going to look at first, and not look at maybe humanitarian reasons or whatever. But the fact is that this is a mainstream published article. So I'll just give you a little bit of a rundown on that. So this was actually a prime time production. So more than 60% of those who applied for asylum the last 12 months at Dublin Airport had no identity documents, according to the Department of Justice figures provided to prime time. The category does not include Ukrainians. In the period from February 2022 to January 2023, of the 6,926 people who applied for asylum at Dublin Airport, a minimum of 4,213, or 61%, had no documents. The figures do not include those who presented false documents to border officials, only those who had no documentation. Frequently, asylum seekers arrive with an agent or a handler or a facilitator who will have supplied false documentation to allow them to board a plane, explained Carol Sinnott of Sinnott Solicitors, who specialises in immigration law. The agent would typically take back the fake documents and instruct the asylum seeker to proceed to passport control with no documents, she said. When asked about the problem on prime time, Justice Minister Simon Harris said that Gardaí were stepping up cooperation with authorities abroad and airlines to combat the number of people boarding Irish-bound planes with false documents. However, Minister Harris acknowledged that there can be legitimate reasons for people to arrive at an airport without documentation. People can be fleeing persecution where it's not possible to get a document, but that doesn't explain all of that. Far from it, he said. Under international, EU and Irish law, Ireland is obliged to process applications of asylum, even in cases where the applicant arrives without documentation. The Justice Minister said, what needs to happen is a much more effective administration of the existing rules that we have in place to make sure that somebody can't get on a plane without the appropriate documentation, and to make sure that there's a very tough approach taken in relation to criminals seeking to exploit this. So, Finbar, I suppose what that story is doing is that's given a different perspective, which some people are pointing out. And a point I want to make as well, I attended the rally on Saturday, and I attended it because the rally was styled as opposing discrimination, and it was styled as an anti-government rally. So those two things are absolutely fine in my view, because the government is central to all the problems in society. As I see it, it needs to be replaced. And I'm totally opposed to discrimination. Now, what I would say is, I believe that 80%, as a rough estimate, of people that are probably protesting out in the street at the moment would be able to tick those two boxes as well, that they are against discrimination and that they oppose the government's policies. So I don't like to see people being absolutely written off for attending protests when their reason for being on a protest is because of lack of services, because of no consultation, things like that. So I feel like there was a gap in really acknowledging that, maybe at the rally on Saturday. I don't like to see division in ordinary working people. And as far as some people will say, the far right are opposing rallies, are creating rallies on the street, which is dividing people. They will also point to say there's a far left agenda, which is dividing people in another way. So really, the ordinary person in the middle is who I'm thinking of, and they need to be represented too.
Yeah, there seems to be this whole discussion has been dominated by extremes in a very unhealthy way. We'll move on to the next story, Padraig, and you're leading with this again. This is about the Tuam baby scandal that's been going on for so long now, and it looks like the excavation of the site is not going to go ahead as planned.
So the Commission of Investigation into Mother and Baby Homes concluded last year that 978 children had died at the Tuam Mother and Baby Homes following the work of local historian Catherine Corliss. The evacuation at the site of the former Tuam Mother and Baby Home will be one of the most complex forensic excavations and recovery efforts ever undertaken anywhere in the world, the Minister for Children has said. Roderick O'Gorman said that the excavation would involve a DNA identification process on a scale never done before in Ireland. The Minister was speaking as the Dáil debated the Institutional Burials Bill 2022 on Wednesday, which would provide a legal basis to allow for the excavation of sites such as that of former County Galway home. The Commission issued its final report in January of last year, though the methodology used in compiling it was criticised by some survivors groups. Mr O'Gorman said the legislation was not site-specific, but that Tuam would be the first such excavation and exhumation. The Minister said what happened at Tuam was a stain on our national conscience. He said he had met many of the families affected and heard the sense of urgency and frustration around why the exhumation has not happened yet. I share that frustration, he said. These families want to give their loved ones the respect and dignity they were so grievously denied in their short lives. The uniquely tragic nature of the site at Tuam means the legislation is required to undertake this work. O'Gorman thanked Miss Corliss, who he said had become a voice for the children in Tuam, and that the state owes her a debt. We can never erase the immense tragedy of what happened there, but this bill will allow us at long last to afford the children interred in that site a respectful burial, he said. It's long past time that we afford those children that basic dignity, so long denied to them. So, you know, like when government minister is coming out and kind of patting themselves on the back for their cleaning this one up, I think only for the work of Catherine Corliss, we wouldn't be any further with this, and it's the state that has the responsibility for this as well. Like, I mean, this is a crime against humanity that's been hidden in Ireland's past, and you know, it's really shocking. And hopefully this is something that we can kind of deal with in our history a little bit better now that the opportunity is there.
I think they're just going to drag it on and on and on, because that's what they do. Did you ever hear such tripe? The requirement for legislation to conduct an excavation to find out what happened. Did you ever hear such tripe? Just do it. Just do it. But they don't want to do it. They just want to move away from this as far away as possible, because Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil were both the dominant parties through all of this and knew all of this was happening. Some of their senior membership are still alive, and they don't want to have anything to do with it. It's an embarrassment to them. It's a stain on them. Just do it. You don't need legislation, to my mind. We'll move on to more international news now. Syria and Turkey experienced a horrific earthquake 3 weeks ago. This week, on a number of occasions, Syria has been attacked by Israel. Damascus has been bombed. We're going to look at some video footage and photographic imagery of that now. And also Gaza has been attacked only today by Israel and this new extremist Israeli government. We'll have a look at some footage here. That was footage in the middle of the night in Damascus, and bombs raining down, and after a horrible earthquake that devastated the the northern part of the country, and not too far from Damascus, really. And now we have this. What do you think of this, Padraig? Israel just seems to be opportunists. Their new government seems to be so extreme, and between attacking Iran, attacking Syria, attacking Gaza again, they're just going gung-ho with the military.
When history is written, I suppose they have the benefit of hindsight, but we have pretty much got the benefit of hindsight now in looking at the atrocities committed by the Israeli state. At a time of humanitarian suffering as well, it really doesn't matter when it is. It's a state that really is out of control at times, I think.
This particular imagery and footage that we just watched, apparently 15 people were killed, a nurse, an optician amongst them. So again, loss of life. Nobody cares in Western media about it. I'm about to show footage now of what must have been a massive piece of artillery ordnance that was dropped on Gaza this morning. A very significant piece of artillery and ordnance. Again, I'm told that there were a number of explosions like this over a period of time in Gaza. Civilians have to be injured. They can't not be injured with explosions like that. Any thoughts, Padraig?
I'm sure for the people in the region, this is such a regular occurrence that it's it doesn't nearly, it wouldn't surprise anybody in the region. But at the same time, the fact that these images and these stories don't get anywhere, that like the Western media and the great and the good that are crying foul of what's happening in Russia and demanding action, they can ignore what's going on in another state that is doing worse and has been for a long time.
Yeah. Sticking with international news and looking at the Ukraine issue and some Irish involvement this week in the Ukraine issue as well. But do you want to lead with an Irish Examiner headline that's marking out the issue of the Irish government sending troops to train soldiers in Ukraine?
So Irish troops will take part in military training in support of Ukrainian soldiers. The government on Tuesday approved the participation of up to 30 Defence Force personnel in the newly established European Union military assistance mission in support of Ukraine. It's understood that these troops will train Ukrainian troops in demining. The primary role of the Defence Forces will be to provide training to members of the Ukrainian Armed Forces in one or more EU member states in which the training will take place. These trainers will be supplemented by a small number of staff positions based in the military planning and conduct capability staff based in Brussels. In the multinational Special Training Command in Strasbourg in Germany. Speaking after the government confirmed its approval of the Defence Forces participation, the Taoiseach Minister for Defence, Micheál Martin, said that the Ukrainian programme will provide vital training support to the Ukrainian Armed Forces, as well as the coordination of EU member states' activities delivering the training. Given Ireland's steadfast support for Ukraine and the considerable experience of our Defence Forces have in providing training both at home and overseas, the government regards the participation of the Defence Forces in this mission as an important signal of Ireland's unwavering support for and solidarity with Ukraine. What I see there, Finbar, is an absolute break of Ireland's position of neutrality without mandate. The cabinet agrees on something. Why isn't it being put to the people?
Yeah, and that question was asked by an Irish member of Parliament, or TD, as we say here in Ireland, Michael McNamara, an independent, who asked about the constitutionality of the decision to send Irish soldiers over to train Ukrainian troops. Let's have a look at this video.
I would like to, I suppose, agree with what most of the previous speakers have said, who but could be affected by the plight of the Ukrainian people, both in Ukraine and those who have come to Ireland and those who haven't come to Ireland but are displaced across Europe now. But I do think it's important that Ireland maintain a position of neutrality. I've always maintained that position. I think what we can offer militarily is close to nothing, in my view. We can barely militarily defend our own territorial waters, much less join a force led by a French Vice Admiral in order to carry out works in Ukraine, no matter how well-intentioned they are. What we can achieve diplomatically, particularly if we maintain the neutral position that Ireland has traditionally held, I think is immensely greater in terms of alleviating the suffering of Ukrainian people, in terms of ensuring that those who are here who want to return to Ukraine, I appreciate not everybody will want to return at the end of this, but for those who do, that they're in a position to return to a peaceful Ukraine which is rebuilding itself. The whole issue of candidate status to the European Union, I think, is a little bit of a red herring, given that membership of the European Union, one of the essential prerequisites is agreed and defined borders, and of course that's to a very large extent what this is about, is Ukraine's borders with Russia. And I completely accept that aggression and unilateral force is not a way to change internationally agreed boundaries, but nevertheless I think we're a long way from having agreed borders. I also think it's very important that we clarify the status of the up to 30 members of the Defence Forces in the newly established European Union Military Assistance Mission under the command of the French Vice Admiral, the stated aim of which is to enhance the military capability of Ukraine's armed forces, and also whether the Dáil Éireann approves the cost that will arise therefrom and the cost of participation in various European Union funds which are funding military activity in Ukraine.
That was Michael McNamara, an Irish Member of Parliament, or TD, talking about Ireland's contribution to the Ukraine narrative and the Ukraine conflict, including a recently announced decision to send up to 30 soldiers from Ireland to train Ukrainian troops. What do you think about what McNamara had to say?
Well, I agree with him in terms of what Ireland can offer in military terms, but that's probably beside the point. Like, the Irish nation has always, going right back to since before the state was founded, the people had generally undertaken the position that we should be neutral. Any time in the past where Irish people got involved in wars, like basically imperial wars, there's been huge costs to Irish people. Bereaved families, huge amounts of deaths fighting in the British Army in the past, trying to achieve limited amounts of self-autonomy. Like, we are quite committed to the position of neutrality, and it's even written into our constitution, and the government at this point is just going ahead and taking absolutely liberties with our neutrality, that it has no mandate to do.
And I know that, I'm pretty sure that if it was put to a vote right now, and polls have said clearly in the past that any application to or referendum to abandon our neutrality would be rejected by the Irish people. So I don't think they've got the kahunas to put it to the Irish people. And so they're trying to stealthily introduce it in this way. And we're not blind. We can see what's happening. And some of our MPs like Mick Wallace and Claire Daly are arguing the case against it as well. Every week, videos are coming out of Ukraine of what is described in law, in legislation in Ukraine, as conscription teams. And these teams, and I believe there are up to 3,000 teams in Ukraine who are soldiers whose job it is to go around with lists conscripting the unwilling. And every week, scores of videos are coming out of Ukraine of these conscription teams going into people's homes, into people's businesses, catching people on the street and dragging them away. We've got a couple of videos again that have come out this week, and this is what we've been asked to support. This is what we've been told is a willing people who want to go to war to defeat Russia. And in reality, from what I can see, when I switch off RTE and when I switch off CNN and BBC and I start looking for stuff myself, what I see is the people who are not willing to fight anymore. The conscripting 16 to 60-year-olds. And in fact, I saw a video this week of what looked to me to be a child, about maybe 14, 15, loading mortars to be fired in the battleground. And it's just horrific. And this is what our calls for neutrality on this show. And this is what other organizations who are calling for neutrality, this is what we're against. We're against the waste of life of hundreds of thousands of people being killed unnecessarily, and of now children and pensioners being dragged into the conflict. Have a look at these two videos. Some just horrific videos of people being taken away against their will. In the first video, it was clear that the young man just didn't want to go. He seemed to be pretending to be unconscious, and so they just lifted him up. He certainly wasn't in any way going to contribute to his own sending to the front lines to be killed with mortar shells and to be turned into just pulps of meat, which is what's happening, to be blunt about it. We also spoke with John Moran this week for our Ukraine update, looking at what's happening along the battle lines and what's happening geopolitically with Ukraine and with the Ukraine-NATO-Russia war. Have a look at this and we'll be back to you in a few minutes. John, thanks for joining us this week.
My pleasure.
What have you got for us?
This week, news is coming in of a large-scale Russian offensive along the northern front line from Liman to the Russian border at Belgorod Oblast. Now, this will be interesting because it has been mentioned before that should a strike from Russia come, that the speculation was that it would come from Belgorod. So it's interesting now that we see activity there. All week, Russia deployed offensive dominance all along the front line, especially at Bakhmut in Donetsk, where Ukrainian defenders are now almost completely encircled. Fierce fighting also raged at Ugledar, Avdiivka, and Bakhmut. The Liman and Zaporizhia fronts also show increased activity. It's of interest to viewers here might be the backstory of, say, Avdiivka, because we remember that Bakhmut is the central piece of defense along the entire front line, by far the hardest place to crack. Now, Avdiivka is another one. But one of the interesting things about Avdiivka is that is a place where shelling of Donetsk has come from most regularly. So you will find it's a place of dread for the people of Donetsk, and it's one of the main firing points at the city. I would expect that Russian forces will not go easy here. I'd like to mention as well here, that according to polls, some 60% of Germans, Austrians, and even Americans are in favor of peace talks and an end to the conflict, which I think is interesting. The other point I wanted to mention again was, now that we know that as far back as 2014, the EU was party to a NATO ruse to fool Russia with peace talks in Minsk, which NATO started, which started off a process of training Ukrainian soldiers for the next 8 years for a war with Russia. Now, the point is that the EU knew this when they were telling us that Russia was the aggressor. So sanctions on Russia could have to be looked at again, given that the EU was not an honest player in this and was not honest with us, the Irish people. Or if they were honest to Leo and Micheál, they certainly didn't pass on that to us. But I think that's a very serious point. There's another very interesting point that came up here. The G20 is meeting in India very shortly. And India is a key country in this whole contest, as we knew from day one when Micheál came home from New York shouting at India to get off the fence. A disgraceful episode. We should have been with India as a neutral country, but no. Now, India has now said that it is hosting the G20 and it is chairing the G20 meeting, and it is not allowing any country to bring up weapons for Ukraine or anything of that nature. It's just about business. So I think that's an interesting development too, a firming up of the those who aren't part of the garden, as it were. One feature of note I should mention as well in the attack on Avdiivka, for the first time, Russia has used heavy bombers. each of which can drop a 500 kilogram of explosive from a great height. The effect of these is much greater than even the heaviest of artillery on the ground. They can obliterate the strongest of defenses. And what's interesting is that Russia felt that they could put up these planes safely without any risk to them. So it would appear that the Russians might feel that they have obliterated the defenses that they wanted to obliterate, because any day now, a breakthrough is inevitable, I think.
Okay.
And in other news, China, as we speak, is preparing a position paper on peace in Ukraine. It'll be published over the next few days. And Chinese senior Politburo member Wang Yi announced that Beijing is ready to unite militarily with Russia to defend the national interest of both countries. Again, that's a very serious development, because the pussyfooting is over. And there is a problem, another problem that is added into this febrile mix, which is that Russia has suspended the new START treaty talks on reducing strategic offensive arms. So we're now in a situation where unless we get talks soon, we have a free-for-all in the international sphere. This whole thing has messed up world relations, I think, forever. The system is broken, and I don't think it's going to work again. The non-white European American world will not put up with us any longer, I don't think.
Yeah, that's some summation for the week, and that's some developments. That's the first time that I've come across utterances from the Chinese government to the effect that they would be willing to participate in military co-defense. Now, they have had recent war exercises together, but they have never made, to my knowledge, statements like that. We do actually have an image that's in some ways comical on the issue of the meeting between Lvovsk and Yi, but at the same time, there's a serious satirical element to it as well. They're both laughing, and Lavrov is saying, and then Biden says, "Russians, we do not wish you harm." And they're just laughing at the idea that anybody could believe anything that the US would say currently. Just before we focus on that a little bit more, John, I'd just like to go back. You mentioned about the bombing of Donetsk city, which has no military importance whatsoever in the war, but has been bombed persistently since 2014, really. But since the commencement of these military actions and maneuvers, it's been bombed with cluster bombs, with mines, and a lot of civilians have been killed and injured. And this is ongoing, and it's never mentioned in the news. You have some footage from a bombing in Donetsk this morning. We'll just have a quick look at that.
Once again, I mean, you could show this footage every day of the week in Donetsk city, because it is being bombed from places like Avdiivka, which are heavily dug in, so heavily dug in fact, that it's taking so long to get past them. But I will say in Bakhmut, the Russians have taken 5 kilometers of land in their offensive, and that's quite large. So the Bakhmut trap is closing, or has closed.
Yeah. Just staying with Donetsk City for a little second, and we'll move on to Bakhmut. From my observations and from the reporting coming out of Donetsk and clear video footage that is indisputable, it looks like they're just lobbing missiles all over the city. There's no strategic plan to it. There's no way. It's almost like they just want all the civilians to flee out of that city. because it's shops, it's shopping streets, it's buses. I've seen videos of absolute carnage on the streets of Donetsk, but there doesn't seem to be any military objective in doing it.
Well, unfortunately, in this country, we have a particular dislike of violence, of war, because of our history of we were downtrodden for almost 1,000 years. So it's not unnatural we'd have a particular aversion to any form of violence, which is why uh, you'll have people like Micheál Martin and all others will go to Enniskillen and various other places to show their concern for deaths that have taken place. Well, where is that concern for the people of Donetsk? What have they done to deserve this?
Quite the opposite, in fact. Rather than concern, there seems to be concealment and avoiding at all costs, even acknowledging that something like that is happening in Donetsk, the people that the Irish government are more and more supporting in a military way. Just to move on to Bakhmut, John, I know you wanted to focus on that a little bit. It's been months on months essentially under siege now. Is that siege finally coming to an end?
Well, I have a slight suspicion that the final evacuation of Bakhmut was awaiting the departure of Joe Biden, because it might have been embarrassing prior to a visit from him should they have evacuated, because it is essential, according to Zelensky's view, that they give a positive sound, a positive note on how things are going. Otherwise, they won't get more weapons. And the tragedy is, if they get more weapons, more and more of them will die. I mean, it's something like 5 to 6 to 1 ratio on the front line of Ukrainian to Russian deaths. So even if it stays as it is without any advance for the Russians on the front line, if every day they maintain that particular advantage, they win. They don't have to move.
But even when they do fall back eventually and they do give up Bakhmut, they will try to promote that as some kind of an advance. It seems to be the nature of the Ukrainian military propaganda machine and the Western media machine that they will put that down as an advancement in some way, as opposed to what it really is.
Well, an awful lot of what you get from the Ukrainian side is PR. And it's coming from Zelensky. I mean, it's his business. He has his Kvartal 95 studio company still making films during this imbroglio. But even now, some of his friends, even in the Irish government, in European governments, I have no doubt we have reached a point where we won't go any further, or we don't want to go any further. I think we've reached that point. There's never any agreement in Europe now on sanctions. They always break up in disagreement. The United Front is breaking up.
And so do you think with these utterances of unity from the likes of Biden, I see Giorgia Meloni visiting Kiev this morning, do you think these utterances are really a case of the lady doth protest too much, and that in reality behind the scenes they're actually getting ready to cut ties?
Well, I suspect in the not too distant future, those who rushed off to Kiev will be embarrassed that they had done so when it is revealed the full extent of what happened in Ukraine. And that's, forget about the war. I mean, even in their chemical labs where they're doing very heavy experiments that would not be allowed in the United States, they do them there. offshore. And they have made sure they have taken all that they could out of Ukraine while they were departing from places before the Russians arrived. Although there is an SBU, a former SBU, which is Ukrainian special branch, if you like, officer who has defected to the Donbass side, and he has some very good information on them.
What was the nature of that information, John?
Well, I got a contact from someone on a Donbass channel, and they asked, would I be interested in hearing what he has to say? He had some very interesting information. And I said, I'd be interested, all right, but I mean, I only tweet and do that sort of thing. And they have me banned again at the moment. This is the 77th Regiment, the British Army unit.
The Infowar unit.
They're the ones who are monitoring our stuff.
Yeah, but this guy, this retired or this defected SBU guy, what was the nature of the type of information? You don't have to go into detail, but the nature of the information that he had.
Well, if you know the SBU and what they are engaged in, and especially what they've been engaged in this past 8 years, when all of this was being planned. I mean, he has all that information, it would make a good interview, I think, but there's nothing I can do with it.
Yeah, we might make contact with that guy. In the meantime, John, you mentioned earlier on about the meeting between the foreign ministers of Russia and China, respectively, Lavrov and Yi. There have also been today the beginning of actual trilateral naval exercises between Russia, China, and South Africa. So the European continent, the Asian continent, and the African continent, members on those continents, dominant members, working together, the most dominant economies in those areas working together in a military and naval fashion for self-defense. What do you make of that?
Well, I think what we're seeing there is the future, because South Africa is perhaps the dominant country in South Africa, and it's leading the way. The terrible thing that Europeans have forgotten is that they did dreadful things in Africa, and the Africans don't forget that sort of thing. While they might go home to Europe and forget all about their African adventures, they haven't been forgotten there. So they know whose side they're on in this particular case. And it's not the side of the white, what should I say?
Continuing colonialist, because there is still
new colonialism, because this is what Ursula von der Leyen is planning for the future, that Europe, moves into African minerals. We know what that's all about. Yeah. The problem with Africa and the problem with elsewhere is that European and American countries have been ripping them off for too long. They need to be looked after, not exploited. And exploiting them isn't the way forward if Ursula von der Leyen thinks it is.
We drive all of their youth out to work in low-paid jobs in Europe and the United States and places like that.
And to be looked down on, and all of that. I mean, if you look at this whole thing of the world population and all this comes into the Russian-Ukrainian war and all that as well. I mean, you saw recently there was some friction in Irish society, because a huge number had been brought in last year. And there was friction. Of course there was friction. I mean, if you dump people into an area like Ainger Street, where I live, and there's several hostels for down and outs and drug addicts and all the rest of it, And all the state can think of about the area is to dump places in it. So the locals are upset about this. There's nothing for the locals, nowhere for there's a small little square patch where kids can play football, but nothing else. And it's a vast inner city area with the highest number of blocks of flats in the country. So that friction that was exposed led to a march by nice people in Dublin, and they were all nice people, and they had the best of intentions, that they like foreigners and things like that. But it doesn't move the situation an inch.
Yeah.
The situation will still persist. I mean, if RTE, who was advertising that march since early morning, for the first time I remember them advertising a march, they're usually trying to downplay them, but they were advertising them. So they wanted to happen. And, we could have all gone down with placards saying, "We mean well," and chanted it, but it's meaningless.
Yeah.
The problem that was caused by the government failing to prepare and make way for the numbers. It was even fewer numbers than they thought were coming, 70,000 instead of 100,000.
But isn't the government still fanning the flames of war in Ukraine and continuing to create the environment where people feel that they have to flee? So it's not just the case to fail to prepare. They are a part of the contributing voices to this narrative.
Well, it's only a matter of time before the news comes out from all around Ukraine of the numbers of young men that have died so far, because it is phenomenal. I'm sure you've seen all the massive graves with flanks of flags, Ukrainian flags, into the distance, all of them young men. And that's everywhere. And they think they're winning.
Yeah.
They've been told that they're winning. They are not. And they've been hammered for a long time. They've been lied to. We've been lied to.
I often maintain that the people of Ukraine are, in many respects, being held hostage by the government that's in Kiev at the moment, in terms of the information that they've been provided, but also in terms of conditions that have been set by this government, in which there's no free press, there's no free opposition, political opposition. People are being disappeared. People can be beaten on the street because they don't support this war. People are afraid to talk. So I maintain that people are being held hostage indeed. John, do you want to finish up with anything before we go this week?
Well, I would like just to continue what you're saying there. We think that BlackRock has bought up about 20% of Ukrainian farmland, What they're doing is they're selling off Ukraine. This is like a fire sale. Zelensky is a horrible little man who is allowing his countrymen and women to die in huge numbers so that he can escape to Florida to a mansion, or he might go to the one that he has in Italy, or spend his €1 billion elsewhere. That's what he's doing. He's building his bank balance.
I suppose when it comes to wars, whether it's the First World War, the Second World War, the Vietnam, if there's any war we can mention, Iraq, there are the oligarchs and the billionaires who will sit back rubbing their hands, and the shareholders, so people who've got pensions and their shares they'll sit back rubbing their hands thinking, oh, what a wonderful war.
Well, when you think, the best example of that is the defense secretary, the US defense secretary, who was responsible for all things military, including this war. He came straight from Raytheon, one of the big war companies, and they had to change the rules so that he could come direct, because there had been a law that you had to wait 5 years before you could be on a government role after being on the board of a company. But they changed it for him. So he is the guy now, big war, Minister for War.
And nobody knows who he is.
He's a shareholder
Yeah, but
in
nobody,
Raytheon.
he isn't even a known personality. He was taken straight from a company. That to me, that's from an economic, philosophical point of view. That's fascism. That's when companies directly direct government.
It is fascism, and it's happening all over the place. People are moving in and out of government from big war companies, from big tech companies, from big pharma companies, from Wall Street. It's a revolving door for that. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, Joseph and Josephine Soap in the United States, their conditions are worsening, and their government just wants war. Will put any amount of money into war, no money into healthcare, no money into building up the country that has fallen so far with the kind of economics that it has had this past 20 years.
But they're continually being told by their government that things are getting better. And they've been told ridiculous lies. For instance, X amount of jobs have been created since Biden took power. But in reality, what's happened is the pandemic restrictions are over. And so existing jobs were just restarted again. But he's trying to claim some kudos for that. John, we're running out of time. Do you want to finish up with anything this week?
Yeah, just those jobs that you referred to there. Some people have 3 of them to go to it every day, and they're still not making enough.
Oh, I'll tell you one thing, and I work, and I'm sure you work at this kind of stuff Monday to 10, 11, 12 every night, and we don't get a penny for it. But we're happy in what we're doing because we believe we're part of a cause to get free speech and balance out there to people.
Well, I'm a great believer. My motto is my heart is where the hurt is.
That's a good motto.
Wherever there is hurt, I want to fix it or do something maybe to make an effort. Well, that's my motto.
And maybe just stand on the toes and cause a little bit of hurt to the big and the powerful.
Oh, with them, I don't care about them. You know, I have no problem hurting them.
John, I'll see you next week for next week's update.
Oh.
That was the irrepressible John Moran giving us his weekly update on Ukraine, and we'll be back to talk to John, please God, next week. Demonstrations are starting to occur all over Europe against NATO, against US expansionism and the US impulse to drive this war further and further towards further escalation. The demonstrations were in Greece, in Moldova, and in Munich in Germany. The Moldova demonstration was not just about looking for peace. It was against NATO interference in the country and Ukrainian calls for Moldova to allow Ukraine to physically or militarily assault a Russian region that's bordered with Moldova. We'll have a look at some of these protests.
Καθιστά χρέος μας να στηρίξουμε την αντιπολεμική διαδήλωση σήμερα, όλοι μαζί εργαζόμενοι, οι νέοι και ταυτόχρονα.
That's protests that are happening in Europe. As I've said, there's a demonstration in Dublin this coming Saturday, the 25th of February at 1 p.m. at the Spire, calling for Irish neutrality to be reinforced and calling for an end to the war. So be there if you can. We'll have the M Compass Media team there to film some footage and to talk to a few of the attendees to ask them why they attended. In the meantime, that's all for tonight, folks. Thanks for tuning in. Please like, share, subscribe wherever you can. Click in during the week to M Compass Media's website, mcompassmedia.com. There's some news stories that we wouldn't put on social media that you'll get on our website where we're freer to be who we want to be. In the meantime, thanks for tuning in again. That's all from me.
Thanks very much from me as well. Good night.